Right, thank you very much. And thank you, Prof, for inviting me to present this afternoon. I'm based at the University of Zimbabwe. I'm a lecturer in pharmaceutical sciences, and my research interest lies in analytical chemistry, pharmaceutical compounding, and hence my interest in looking at the public health impact of substandard and falsified medical products in Africa. So just a peek into history, the history of pharmacy and how drug regulations came about. There are two outstanding incidents, one being what happened in 1937, where more than 100 people died in the United States after taking an antibiotic syrup, which contained diethylene glycol. So it was due to poisoning from diethylene glycol. And the other incident was from the period between 1956 and 1960, where with about 10,000 babies that were born with deformities, and investigation into this revealed that their mothers had taken thalidomide. So it's known as the thalidomide tragedy. So these two incidents, because they made headlines, they led to the pharmaceutical industry being as highly regulated as it currently is. Looking at what has been happening during the COVID-19 pandemic, because countries generally were looking inwards, there were logistics issues because the pharmaceutical industry is globalized, and that adds to complexity in supply chain. So we noticed that there was reduced air cargo capacity that led to shortages in medical supplies, and there was some sort of panic. People were looking for these COVID-related supplies, be they medicines or PPE, masks, and all that. And people resorted to alternative sources of supplies. There was a lot of stockpiling. Because of that, there's also proliferation of substandard and falsified medicine. They say if you want to know which product is trending, just look at the black market. And that was quite evident during this pandemic, which products were trending. Given the observations that we've made during the pandemic, why should we be concerned about the proliferation of these poor quality medical products? So I've just combined the substandard and counterfeit medicines, and we just call them poor quality medical products. So the one outstanding thing is that they cause adverse effects. As I mentioned earlier, usually we pay attention when something has happened. For example, 84 Nigerian children died between the period 2008 to 2009 after taking a syrup called Mypic, and again, it contained diethylene glycol, so it was due to poisoning. And in Zambia, clinicians also observed unpredictable adverse effects and when they investigated, they realized it was because of an anesthetic injection, propofol. So it was substandard and was causing unpredictable adverse effects, such as breathing problem or even a skin rash or hives in these patients. So that is the main problem, and that usually there's a lot that is happening with these products, but it's only when something big happens, then action is taken against that. So we can just look at what are the hidden health impacts. Also, another reason why we should be concerned about having such products on the market. So this is an illustration of what happens to blood concentrations after taking medication. So ideally, we would want adequate amounts of a drug dose in the body so that we have the intended therapeutic effect. If there's too much of the dose, then we hit toxic levels, and that causes adverse effects, unwanted side effects. Or if there's too little of the active ingredient in a medical product, it means that we have subtherapeutic levels. So the drug is not doing what it's supposed to do in the body. So that leads to cases of drug resistance, which is also something quite big in Africa. When we talk about antimicrobial resistance, resistance towards antimalarials and tuberculosis. So another effect is we get economic losses. So these are not really direct and so obvious, but this is what's slowly happening to our communities or to our nations if we allow poor quality medicines to be used. So it means people are paying more due to medication replacement. So there's an impression that something does not work, and therefore, people are constantly changing courses, repeating courses, and that costs money. Also, there's an impact on treating adverse effects. So if the products are contaminated, they cause adverse effects, and that's also additional costs in treating the patients. And workforce, it also affects workforce in terms of there's loss of income, people are ill, or there's prolonged illness. And another unwanted effect is that it causes loss of trust in the healthcare system. People do not trust their medical practitioners or pharmacists in general. So how can we avoid these? How can we avoid harm from poor quality medicine? So it's actually preventable harm, and the different stakeholders in this issue all need to be active. So looking firstly at government, and under government, I've also put medicines regulators, since it's an arm of governmental policies, and they're responsible for legislation, regulations, and I think Ritabile has highlighted this very well. And with medicines regulators, a good example is what the local regulatory authorities in Zimbabwe, the Medicines Control Authority of Zimbabwe, is doing. They're being very active. They're working with the police in terms of enforcing the law and looking out for places where we've got unregulated sale of medicines. They're also involved in checking the ports of entry, just to make sure that whatever is being transported into the country or imported into the country is the right substance and of good quality. Because there's a lot that happens, for example, in Bridge, where people go to all sorts of lengths to avoid the official border post because they're smuggling all sorts of goods, including medicines. So, for example, you can imagine someone has a bag and it happens on that day that, okay, so one way is they can either take a canoe across the river Limpopo into Zimbabwe, or sometimes they actually have to swim. So they're swimming with the product in there. So I don't know, the product is being exposed to extreme conditions. So it's high temperatures, high humidity, and that compromises the quality by the time it gets to the market. So another stakeholder would be medicines manufacturers and wholesalers. They need to adopt to good manufacturing and good wholesale practices. One of the projects that we're working on is actually on implementing quality by design. So using software such as GastroPlus or Minitab to actually instill quality at the development stage. So we can test products, and that is great, but quality cannot be instilled into a product by testing. It actually needs to start from the product development stage. So it's one of the things that manufacturers could consider and should consider, that instead of us relying just on the testing end of things, but we start with quality raw materials, quality APIs. And the pandemic also affected manufacturers in the sense that they were not able to always get their raw materials from the regulated sources. So in some cases, they had to compromise and just get the raw materials from unregulated sources that were not very reliable. But as a way of just surviving the pandemic and the complexities that came with it. The wholesalers as well, where the source of the medicines that they're distributing is also important, as well as the conditions under which they're storing the medicines. There's also another issue when it comes to tropical regions where there's high humidity and high temperatures that actually affects drug products. So we need to always be carrying out studies to ensure that the products that are being distributed are still in good condition. Educators also play a critical role. Ritabile mentioned the importance of skills and how there's a shortage of the right skills that we need to ensure that we have safe products on the market. So educators could play a good role in the training bit of things, the technical skills that are needed, as well as the skills that are needed in assessing risks when people are working in maybe like in the clinical settings, like in the hospitals and pharmacies. Patients are also a critical part of this because they're the end users. So the risk of unsafe products actually increases as the product gets closer to the patient. So the patients also, we need to carry out public awareness campaigns so that people really understand the gravity of this situation and what the impact is to their health. And so they need to be empowered and they should know how to report adverse events. And also the MCAZ has been doing a great job at educating people on how they can report adverse events. Also good medicine storage practices at home. And then lastly, we've got healthcare practitioners who should also really appreciate the gravity of the situation and how we can promote good quality medicines on the market. So we're looking at good distribution and compounding practices. And I'll just highlight a bit more on compounding. I think it's something that's sort of underplayed, but it's another good source of access, getting medicines onto the market. But there's no standardization, and it's a problem world over, where in most cases, there are compounding practices being carried out, but there really isn't a standardization, which means there's a chance that product quality is being compromised at that stage. All right, so what do we need to, what are the key considerations regarding this issue? So looking at what has been happening with the COVID-19 pandemic, it clearly is changing the face of the pharmaceutical industry in Africa. And many governments are keen on boosting local production of pharmaceutical products. It's also something that's currently under, that's being talked about even here in Zimbabwe, even in South Africa. So in Africa generally, governments are feeling the pressure of us being self-sufficient. That's regarding medicines and even vaccines because of what we've experienced by waiting in the line for, because of the complex supply chain. And according to a study carried out by McKinsey, there was a projected growth across board with pharmaceutical products. And this was around 2020. So you can see that the market is growing and even the predicted growth of about 56 to 70 billion US dollars by 2020. So what does this mean? All right, so with that growth and the pharmaceutical market is also being caused by urbanization, but also we have a high disease burden and it feels like the pandemic just collided with epidemics. So there is clearly a market. And it's also a reflection of how there's improved access to life-saving medicines. But if more people are gaining access to these medicines and they're causing suboptimal treatment, or if they're contaminated and they're causing adverse effects, are we going to achieve the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, health goals, which include elimination or at least an end to the epidemics, particularly the 3 deadly infectious diseases, which are malaria, tuberculosis, HIV, and AIDS. And this is something that's critical because access does not mean that there's effective treatment unless if it's a good quality product. So in a nutshell, I'm saying we can have a short-term value, which is a cheaper product, but if it's of poor quality, it imposes a higher cost for the healthcare system by harming the patient that is meant to save. All right, thank you very much for listening, and here are my details in case you're interested in any research collaborations in the area of quality assessment of pharmaceutical products on the market, as well as how we can standardize compounded preparations in clinical settings. Please do not hesitate to reach out to me. Thank you.
All right, well, yeah, thank you very much. So do we have any questions for the 2 speakers or any comments? So these are young researchers, and I think my advice is is to try and focus on a message. And sometimes I kind of got lost, I think, as to I really would want to know, what's happening on the ground, and maybe let's get to Ziada. Ziada, can you tell us what's happening on the ground?